Good evening. I want to begin by thanking the Philosophy Club for the invitation to participate in tonight's debate, and I also am glad for Richard's willingness to participate as well. Now, the question before us this evening is, did Jesus rise from the dead? In my opening speech, I'm going to lay out some reasons why I answer yes to this question, and I presume that Richard will lay out his reasons for saying no. Now, there are at least two ways to a knowledge of Jesus' resurrection, the existential and the historical. Tonight, I want to focus on the historical case for Jesus' resurrection. I realize that the vast majority of Christians have not based their belief in Jesus' resurrection on historical considerations, but on a personal encounter with the living Lord himself. And I think that this existential approach is fully legitimate. But I also think that a good case can be made historically for Jesus' resurrection as well. Now, one doesn't come to a study of Jesus' resurrection in a vacuum, so let me lay out very clearly two presuppositions with which I approach tonight's question. First, I presuppose the existence of God, as demonstrated by the arguments of natural theology. This is the approach taken by classical defenders of the resurrection, such as Hugo Grotius, Samuel Clarke, and William Paley, as well as by such contemporary scholars as Wolfhard Pannenbach, Richard Swinburne, and Stephen Davis. And it's the approach that I've taken in my published work. Now, I realize that Richard doesn't share this presupposition. He's an atheist who denies that God exists. This is a huge difference which will, of course, radically affect how we assess competing explanations of the facts. But our time and topic are limited tonight, so if we want to debate about the existence of God, we may just have to schedule another debate. Second, I presuppose that our background knowledge includes a good deal of information about the historical Jesus, including his radical personal claims, his teaching, and his crucifixion. In so doing, I stand squarely in the mainstream of New Testament scholarship regarding the historical Jesus. Again, I realize that Richard doesn't share this presupposition. Richard takes the extremist position that Jesus of Nazareth never even existed, that there was no such person in history. This is a position which is so extreme that to call it marginal would be an understatement. It doesn't even appear on the map of contemporary New Testament scholarship. So I'm also very safely situated with respect to my second presupposition. In tonight's debate, then, I propose to defend two major contentions. One, there are four historical facts which must be explained by any adequate historical hypothesis: Jesus' burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of his disciples' belief in his resurrection. And two, the best explanation of those facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Let's look at that first contention more closely. I want to share four facts which are accepted by the large majority of New Testament historians. Fact number one, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. Scholars have established this fact on the basis of evidence such as the following. One, Jesus' burial is multiply attested in early independent sources. The burial account is part of Mark's source material for the story of Jesus' passion. This is a very early source, which is probably based on eyewitness testimony and dates to within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion. Moreover, Paul, in his first letter to the church of Corinth, also cites an extremely early source for Jesus' burial, which most scholars date to within a few years or even months of the crucifixion. Independent testimony to Jesus' burial by Joseph is also found in the special sources behind Matthew and Luke and in the Gospel of John. Historians consider themselves to have hit historical pay dirt when they have two independent sources for the same event. But we have the remarkable number of at least 5 independent sources for Jesus' burial, some of which are extraordinarily early. 2, as a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. There was an understandable hostility in the early church toward the Jewish leaders. In Christian eyes, they had engineered a judicial murder of Jesus. Thus, according to the eminent New Testament scholar Raymond Brown, Jesus' burial by Joseph is very probable, since it is almost inexplicable why Christians would make up a story about a Jewish Sanhedrist who does what is right by Jesus. For these and many other reasons, most New Testament critics concur with Dale Allison's verdict that all in all, it is highly likely that Jesus' corpse was placed in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. Fact number 2. On the Sunday after the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. The wide majority of scholars also concur with this fact. Here, Richard finds himself among that minority of scholars who deny the fact of the empty tomb. He claims that the empty tomb story is a fictional literary creation of Mark. But the reasons which have convinced most scholars of the historicity of Jesus' empty tomb also go to refute Richard's hypothesis. 1. The historical reliability of the burial account supports the empty tomb. If the account of Jesus' burial is accurate, then the site of Jesus' grave was known in Jerusalem to Jew and Christian alike. In that case, it's a very short inference to the historicity of the empty tomb. So long as a corpse lay interred in Joseph's tomb, a Christian movement in Jerusalem, founded on belief in the resurrection of Jesus, would never have arisen. 2. The empty tomb is multiply attested in independent early sources. Mark's passion source didn't end with Jesus' burial, but with the story of the empty tomb, which is tied to the burial account verbally and grammatically. Moreover, Matthew and John rely on independent sources about the empty tomb. Jesus' empty tomb is also mentioned in the early sermons, independently preserved in the Acts of the Apostles. And it's implied in the very old tradition handed on by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthian church. Thus we have multiple early attestation of the fact of the empty tomb in at least 4 independent sources. Therefore, it can't be a Markan literary creation, as Richard imagines. 3. The tomb was discovered empty by women. In patriarchal Jewish society, the testimony of women was not highly regarded. In fact, the ancient Jewish historian Josephus says that on account of their boldness and levity, women shouldn't even be permitted to serve as witnesses in a Jewish court of law. Now, in light of this fact, how remarkable it is that it is women who are the discoverers of Jesus' empty tomb. Any later legendary account would certainly have made male disciples, like Peter and John, discover the empty tomb. The fact that it is women, rather than men, who are the chief witnesses to the empty tomb is best explained by the fact that they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the gospel writers faithfully record what for them was an awkward and embarrassing fact. 4. The story is simple and lacks theological embellishment. Mark's empty tomb story is uncolored by the theological and apologetical motifs that would be characteristic of a Christian creation. For example, it's remarkable that in Mark's account, the resurrection of Jesus is not actually described at all. Contrast later forged gospels in which Jesus is seen emerging from the tomb in glory to a multitude of witnesses. In Mark's account, there's no proof from prophecy cited, no mention of Jesus' descent into hell, no heralding of a new eon, no description of or reflection on the resurrection body, not even any use of glorious titles for Christ. At the very most, the critical historian would want to excise from Mark's account the angelic figure as an embellishment. And what remains is stark in its simplicity. Mark's story has all the earmarks of a very primitive tradition which is free of theological and apologetical reflection. This tells powerfully against Richard's hypothesis of Markan literary creation. 5. The earliest Jewish polemic presupposes the empty tomb. In the 28th chapter of Matthew, we find a Christian attempt to refute the earliest Jewish polemic against the resurrection. What were Jews saying in response to the disciples' proclamation? He is risen from the dead. That his tomb still contained his body there in the hillside? That the disciples were crazy? No. They said the disciples stole away his body. Now think about that for a moment. The disciples stole away his body. The earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was itself an attempt to explain why the body was missing. And thus the testimony of the very adversaries of the early Christian movement supports the historicity of the empty tomb. I could go on